makes you think, doesn't it? This whole idea of how old the Earth actually is, how everything got started. You hear about these, massive scientific timescales, billions of years. It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is.
But then you also find these very different ways of looking at the same basic question.
Yeah, completely different frameworks sometimes.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. We got some material sent in from one of you listeners.
Oh, great. What is it?
It's a document called Creation and the Age of the Earth by Eric Lyons. So we'll be focusing on that.
Okay, Eric Lyons got it. So what's the plan? What's our mission for this deep dive?
Well, the idea is to really unpack the arguments he lays out in there, about how the universe was created, the Earth's age, all seen through a specific reading of the Bible.
Right, so focusing specifically on the points he's making in that document.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the core issue, as he frames it, is this clash between two views. Well, on one side, you've got creation happening in 6 literal, normal days, 24-hour days.
Okay, the traditional view for many.
And on the other side, you have the scientific picture, billions of years, which is often linked with, accommodating evolutionary timelines.
Gotcha. So that's the main tension we'll be exploring, based on this material.
That's the plan.
So where does Lyons start? What's his opening argument?
He kicks off by talking about how Genesis 1 used to be understood. He basically says, look, for thousands of years, people read Genesis 1 and took it pretty much at face value. Creation took 6 normal days.
Okay, so establishing that as the sort of historical baseline interpretation in his view.
Right. And then he brings up this concern. He feels that modern science, specifically dating methods...
like carbon dating, radiometric dating, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Those methods, he argues, have led some Bible believers, as he puts it, to rethink Genesis 1. To reinterpret those days as maybe, incredibly long periods of time instead. Billions of years even.
So moving away from the literal day interpretation because of scientific dating.
That's his concern. And he tackles this idea that some people might feel, well, that saying creation didn't take billions of years is somehow limiting God, like suggesting he couldn't take that long if he wanted to.
Ah, okay, so addressing a potential objection there.
Yeah, but he flips it. He says, look, the question isn't about what God could have done. I mean, the document's clear. God is omnipotent. He could do anything.
Right. That's not the debate from his perspective.
No. The real point, he stresses, is what does the Bible say God did? It's about sticking to the text, to his word.
So focusing purely on the scriptural account itself.
Exactly. The document points straight to Genesis 1. God created everything in 6 days. Full stop.
And does he bring in other scriptures to support that literal 6-day reading?
He does. A really key one, he argues, is from Exodus chapter 20.
Okay, Exodus 20, that's the 10 Commandments, right?
Yeah, specifically the bit about the Sabbath. Verses 8 to 11, remember the pattern, work for 6 days, rest on the 7th.
Because God rested on the 7th day after creating for 6.
Precisely. And the author's argument is simple. That command, that whole parallel, it only really makes sense if God's creation days were also normal, regular days, like the days in our work week.
Okay, so the structure of the human week is modeled directly on the creation week, implying the days are the same kind of days.
That's the connection he's making.
Interesting. So how does he then tackle the whole issue of humanity's place in all this, especially compared to the scientific view?
Right, so he first lays out the evolutionary perspective as he understands it. The universe is maybe 14 billion years old, give or take.
Based on cosmological data, yeah.
And in that vast timeline, humans show up incredibly late, like really, really late in the game.
Yeah, the cosmic calendar analogy is often used, where if the universe's history is 1 year, humans appear in the last few seconds of December 31st.
He uses a similar one, a 24-hour day. If the Big Bang is midnight, humans arrive with just 2 seconds left before the next midnight.
Wow. That really emphasizes the vastness of time before us in that model.
It does. And then he makes this point. He says, look, if the Bible actually taught this, if it hinted at billions of years before humans,
then Christians would accept it.
Yeah, he thinks they would, just like they accept other miracles in the Bible. The issue for him isn't the time scale itself, it's whether the Bible supports it.
Okay. So what does he argue the Bible does say about the timing?
Well, this is crucial. He argues the Bible never hints at those long ages. In fact, he says it points the other way, towards a much shorter timeline.
How so? What evidence does he present from the text?
He looks at phrases like, before the foundation of the world, You find that in John 17, 1 Peter 1, Ephesians 1, often talking about God's plans or Christ's existence before creation.
Okay.
And he contrasts that with the evolutionary timeline, where humanity arrives billions of years after that foundation. He sees a disconnect there. How could God choose people before the foundation if they wouldn't exist for billions of years after it?
Right, so a potential timing clash in his interpretation. What else?
He brings up something Jesus said in Luke's Gospel, chapter 11. Jesus talks about the blood of prophets shed from the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel. And the author reasons, well, Abel was right near the beginning of the human story in Genesis. So if his time was from the foundation of the world, that suggests humans were around much, much earlier than the evolutionary timeline allows, close to the beginning.
Linking Abel directly to the foundation.
Then there's Mark chapter 10. Jesus is teaching about marriage.
Right.
And he says, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female.
Beginning of the creation.
Okay, the author jumps on that. He argues, if Adam and Eve were made from the beginning, how can that fit with a timeline where they appear billions of years after the beginning? In that view, they're practically at the end, not the beginning.
So does he clarify what creation means there? Is it just earth or everything?
He does address that. He notes that creation in Mark 10 likely refers to the whole shebang, the sum total of everything God made. But even so, his point stands. Adam and Eve weren't latecomers. They were there from the beginning of that created reality.
So the timing relative to the start of creation is the key for him there.
Exactly. And one more point from Paul in Romans 1. Paul says that God's invisible attributes, his power and divine nature, have been clearly seen ever since the creation of the world, being understood from what was made.
Okay, seen by whom?
Well, that's the author's point. Seen by people. He argues this implies humans must have been around since the creation of the world to be able to see and understand God's attributes through nature.
So if humans weren't around for billions of years after creation started, they couldn't have been perceiving God's attributes since the creation. That's the logic.
That's the connection he's drawing. It creates, from his perspective, a real problem if you try to insert billions of years before humanity.
So bringing all that together, his conclusion is pretty stark then.
It is. He basically says you can't logically have it both ways. You have to choose between the evolutionary account, as commonly understood, and the biblical account, as he interprets it.
Okay, so beyond the timing of humanity, does he look at the actual sequence of events in Genesis 1 versus evolution?
Yes, absolutely. That's the next major section. He argues the order of creation in Genesis 1 flat out contradicts the order proposed by evolutionary science.
Right. Give me an example.
Okay, first big one. Earth versus the sun. Standard cosmology generally has the sun forming first, right, from a nebula, and then planets like Earth form later from the disk of material around it.
Sun first, then Earth. That's the usual picture.
But Genesis 1, as he reads it, has Earth existing on day 1 initially covered in water. The sun, moon, and stars. They aren't explicitly made using the Hebrew word asa until day 4.
So a total reversal of the sequence, Earth before sun in Genesis.
Exactly. And he pushes back against the idea that maybe the sun was there from day 1 but just became visible or was assigned its role on day 4.
How does he argue against that?
He points to the specific Hebrew word used on day 4, asa, which he interprets as meaning made or fashioned, implying an act of creation, not just unveiling.
Okay.
He even draws an analogy. God created light on day 1 before the sun existed on day 4, and he created fruit trees before seeds existed in the way we think of them. It shows God working outside typical natural sequences.
Interesting analogy. What other sequence differences does he highlight?
The state of the early Earth. Evolutionary models often picture a very hot, molten early Earth that cooled down, maybe became dry before oceans formed later from volcanoes or comets.
Right, a hot, dry start, then water.
Genesis 1 starts with water. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters on day 1. Dry land doesn't even appear until day 3 after God separates the waters.
So again, the sequence is flipped. Water first, then dry land in Genesis.
Yep, and then there's plant life, especially fruit trees.
Okay, how does that conflict?
Well, the evolutionary timeline generally puts simple plants first, then much later, complex flowering plants and trees. And usually after some forms of animal life, like fish or insects, had already evolved.
Right, plants evolving over long periods, alongside animals.
But Genesis, he points out, puts all vegetation, including fruit-bearing trees, on day 3. That's before fish and birds on day 5, and before land animals and insects on day 6.
So trees appear fully formed on day 3, before many animals.
And instantly, he emphasizes, God speaks, and it was so. No long process needed. He sees these differences in the order of events as just fundamentally incompatible. You can't really square the Genesis sequence with the evolutionary one if you take Genesis literally.
Okay, so timing, sequence. He sees major conflicts. Does he address attempts to reconcile these, like the day-age theory?
He does, yeah. That's the next big thing he tackles. The idea that maybe the days in Genesis weren't literal 24-hour days, but, long ages or epochs.
Right, the day-age theory. Trying to fit the millions of years into the Genesis framework. How does he respond to that?
He lays out several reasons why he thinks it doesn't work. First off, the Hebrew word itself, yom, for day.
Okay. What's his point about yom?
He acknowledges it can mean different things, like it can mean the 24-hour period or just the daylight part or sometimes a more general, undefined time period, like in Abraham's day.
Sure, words can have multiple meanings depending on context.
Exactly. He says context is usually key. He gives an example about circumcision on the 8th day. It happens on that specific day. Day or night doesn't matter, showing a precise usage.
Okay, so context matters. How does that apply to Genesis 1?
Well, his main argument here, and he cites Henry Morris, a well-known creationist, is that whenever yom is used with a number in the Old Testament, first day, second day, third day, etc., it always means a literal 24-hour day.
Always. How many times does that happen?
He says over 200 instances outside of Genesis 1, like Jonah and the fish for 3 days and nights, or the Israelites marching around Jericho for 6 days before the walls fell on the 7th.
And those are clearly literal days.
Undeniably. So the logic is, if numbered days everywhere else mean literal days, why would the numbered days in Genesis 1 suddenly mean vast ages?
That's a strong textual argument from his side. What else?
The evening and morning formula. Each of the first 6 days ends with the phrase, and there was evening and there was morning the first day, the second day, and so on.
Right, that's a very distinct structure in Genesis 1.
And he argues that these specific Hebrew words, ereb, evening, and boker, morning, when used together in non-prophetic parts of the Old Testament.
Which is hundreds of times, right?
Yes, hundreds of times. He says they consistently refer to the boundaries of a normal 24-hour day cycle, nightfall and sunrise.
Can you give an example he uses?
Sure, like Noah waiting 7 days for the dove, or Moses judging the people from morning till evening, or rules in Leviticus about eating sacrifices the same day, not leaving them till morning, or the cloud over the tabernacle lasting from evening until morning.
Okay, so establishing a pattern of usage for evening and morning, meaning a regular day-night cycle.
Exactly. He argues it's only really in symbolic, prophetic passages that these words might take on a different meaning. So in the historical narrative of Genesis 1, why assume they mean anything other than a literal evening and morning, bounding a literal day?
The implication being that interpreting them as vast ages is imposing an outside idea onto the text.
That's his view. He thinks it's driven by wanting to fit in evolutionary time, not by what the text itself suggests.
Does he raise any other sort of practical problems with the day-age view?
He does. He finishes that section with some pretty pointed questions for day-age proponents.
Like what?
Okay, like if the days of creation were really long ages, what about Genesis 1.14? God creates the sun and moon for signs, seasons, days, and years. If the days are eons, what does years mean in that same verse? Does that also become some undefined, super long period?
That's a tricky one. What else?
Biological questions. If day 3, when plants were made, was millions of years long and included a long period of darkness, the evening part of that age, how did the plants survive?
The darkness problem.
And another one, pollination. Many plants need insects, right? But plants were made on day 3, insects not until days 5 and 6, according to Genesis. If those days were vast ages, how did those plants reproduce for potentially millions of years before their pollinators showed up?
Right, the timing gap becomes a huge biological hurdle in that view.
Yeah, and his final question is sort of about clarity. He says, look, the Holy Spirit, who inspired Scripture, knows how to talk about long time periods. Peter mentions 1,000 years. If God meant the creation days to be long ages, why didn't he just say so clearly instead of using day with numbers and evening and morning?
So why use language that everywhere else seems to mean a literal day if you actually mean an age?
Exactly. So he concludes that the day-age theory just doesn't really stack up when you examine the text closely and consider the implications.
Okay, so summing up the author's whole argument based on this document.
Yeah, to kind of wrap it all together. His core message is that the Bible, read straightforwardly, teaches a creation in 6 literal 24-hour days.
And that this reading is, in his view, completely at odds with standard evolutionary theory and its timescale.
Right. And any attempts to harmonize them, like the day-age theory, he argues, ultimately fail because they contradict the clear meaning of the text or create other logical problems.
So he presents it very much as a stark choice.
He does. He ends by stressing his belief in the clarity of the Bible on this and essentially saying you need to pick a side, evolution or the biblical account as he understands it.
Which definitely leaves us, and you listening, with something to think about.
For sure. Reflecting on all these arguments we've unpacked from the document, what bigger implications might these different views on the creation timeline have, for how we understand God, the Bible, science, our own place in the cosmos?
Or, framing it like the author does, as a choice. What factors really influence how someone approaches these kinds of fundamental questions about origins, especially when different sources of information seem to point in different directions?
Lots to chew on there. Thank you again sincerely to the listener who sent this material in. It's prompted a really fascinating deep dive.
Absolutely. We always appreciate you sharing what's on your mind.
And just like the document itself finished, we welcome you to the next Bible podcast, and you could also send you material and deep dive in it.
Looking forward to the next one.